Welcome to a Canopy interview. My name is Michael Zarathis Cook, and I'm the chief editor of Canopy magazine. You are joining in on an interview with folk artist Alexi Murdoch. Now, if that name rings a bell, then that's because you've probably heard his music on the radio, or you've seen it in a film, or you've discovered it in a record store. He was really prolific in the early 2000s, even mid to late 2000s. He was almost a household name when it comes to the sort of acoustic, lyrically driven folk music that he was making that was also very part of the kind of late folk revival zeitgeist in the mid to late thousands that brought so many artists in North America and to a certain degree in England and made them household names. Now, if you're a big fan of Alexi Murdoch, like I am, there's also a little bit of frustration there because he was super prolific in the 2000s, and then over the last 10 years, not much has happened, right? There's been a great deal of silence in terms of his recordings, which is unfortunate because I think he's a brilliant, brilliant musician, and he was able to tap into something with his lyricism and the atmosphere of his recording aesthetic that even till this day remains unique. His voice is so incredibly unique. The way he plays his guitar is really unique. So that was missing for a very long time. And every once in a while over the last few years, I'll go on Spotify and I'll search up his name to see if anything new has been released. And it always usually comes up empty. But where I did find him, and I think where so many of his fans have been able to keep in touch with Alexi Murdoch, even outside of the recording studio, was on social media over the last 2 years, especially. He's been incredibly vocal about the genocide that's happening in Gaza. He's been outspoken in a way that feels deeply empathetic rather than, the usual sort of sympathy that I think is easy to sort of feign or project or even fake to a certain degree. The degree to which he's been vocal on this topic is also inspiring because he's made it very clear that this is the most important thing to him at this moment. And if he has to burn bridges with record labels or management or even fans that don't think it's an important topic or are very comfortable being on the side of the people committing this genocide, the way that he's attacked this issue relentlessly for the last 2 years has made it very clear where he stands. And even more importantly, he's done so with what we call, or what we've talked about in this issue that's coming out, that this conversation will be a part of in print coming out this fall. He's done so in what we call moral urgency. And this general idea of moral urgency is, most people, even the ones that are silent now, will and want to be on the right side of history on a topic as serious and severe as genocide. So in a couple of years, or maybe even perhaps a couple of months from where we are, the artists, celebrities, politicians, corporate leaders that have all been quiet or evasive on this topic in terms of where they stand, they will eventually come around to it. Like, you just have to, it would be really pessimistic to think otherwise, that most people would be comfortable with what's happening currently. Now, that's the moral thing to do, but that's not necessarily the morally urgent thing to do. The urgent thing to do is to say the right thing when it matters the most, which is now, and in fact, yesterday, is to say the right thing when it's inconvenient and when it perhaps is deeply uncomfortable. That's what moral urgency is. It's not to say the right thing 4 months down the road or 4 years down the road where the right thing is now the status quo or the right thing is the quite obvious thing to say. So that is another thing that stood out with the way that Alexei has been deeply conscious about this topic, is that he's not saying anything super revolutionary or deeply profound. He's just saying that this is wrong. Your silence about it is wrong. And our comfort level with other people's silence in regards to the genocide in Gaza it reflects a deeply sick society. And I think that's a really confrontational way to go about getting the message out there. But when the topic has to do with the extermination of hundreds of thousands of people, to be anything other than confrontational would be to be disingenuous on the topic. So, my hat's been off to Alexi for a very long time, which is why we're having this conversation, because I want to sort of reverse engineer how he got here. Why is it that certain artists are comfortable speaking out? Certain artists that perhaps even have less to lose are not comfortable speaking out. And the folks who have a lot of power in this industry, in the musical industry, or just artists in general, they have both economic and cultural power. The ones that have chosen to be silent, how do they justify that? Can they justify that? And how do we get them to talk, to be more engaged and to be more human about this topic? So, these are all the things that brought this conversation to fruition. And when we interviewed Alexi a couple of weeks ago, he spoke to us from the west, from like the western region of Scotland, which is where he lives. It's this sort of remote area, and I'm putting this intro together now for this interview. It takes us a couple of weeks to put pieces together. And in the interim of the interview, and when I'm recording this, he is now in the West Bank in Palestine. I think it speaks volumes to one of the things that we talk about in this interview. It's this idea of performative activism. It's easy to say in text and write and post all the right things, the things that make you and others feel good, but to actually put your body on, in the in the place where it matters the most, and to stand on business in the place where there's a greatest cost or that there's a significantly greater cost to being outspoken, I think shows his level of dedication and his seriousness and his sincerity on this topic. And I think it inspires the rest of us who may or may not be in a position to do something like that, to reflect on, what does silence look to us, and what level of being outspoken can we challenge ourselves to be? So I think once you remove your hat for someone, there's nothing left to remove, unfortunately. But I the proverbial hat that's left, I take it off again, because here's an artist that he will eventually make music again. That's one of the things that we talk about sort of off mic here. Um, but he has burned some bridges in the industry because he refuses to, you know, toe the line of what managers or record labels expect artists, how they expect artists to behave on topics like this. But more than that, he's sort of gone beyond that and said, I do not want to be a passive activist when it comes to this. I want to be actively involved. And I think there's something deeply commendable about that. Um, so I hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I did, and certainly as much as he did as well. If you do enjoy these interviews, folks, it's just $5 a month. Please consider subscribing and supporting the work that we do here. We're completely independent. And it allows us to be able to have the long form conversations like the one you're about to listen to. We don't think of these things as podcasts in the typical sense. We do like that sort of old school approach to interviewing an artist, which is to treat it exactly as an interview, to show up with questions that hopefully reveal the artist in ways that they have not even considered before, but more importantly, reveal and introduce an artist to longtime listeners and first-time discoverers as well. Alexi, thanks again for having this conversation. We were just saying how hard it will be to keep this conversation in a time frame that respects your schedule, etc. But it's one that I've been looking forward to having for a while, because I've been following you on social media in terms of your outspoken and fervent support of the Palestinian people, and also the way that you communicate your disillusionment with our status quo and the general indifference that people have shown in response to the genocide that's happening in Gaza, which was a lot more prevalent a year ago, 2 years ago when it started. But nevertheless, you've been consistent about it. We're having this conversation a day or two after the murder of a Palestinian journalist, Anas al-Sharif.
Al-Sharif, not just him, his three or four of his colleagues as well,
Yes.
in the same tent. Yeah, so all the last remaining Al Jazeera journalists in Gaza. Yeah, that's right.
And I'm really glad that you pointed out, yes, because there were 5 people in that tent that was bombed.
Yeah.
So definitely their life and their contribution to the coverage of this genocide is equally important. But I bring that up because I don't want to lose sight of the very real dangers that people that are at the center of this tragedy are facing just by talking about it. Like, you're in Scotland, I'm in Canada, and we're able to have this conversation relatively free of duress, but not completely free of it. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that there are people who are having these same conversations and losing their lives because of it. Um, Now, I think what is also important to appreciate right away is that even if, we're not being bombed by Israel, with your career, for example, there still
Mm.
could be real consequences in terms of how comfortable studios feel with you, friends, other
Right.
artists, because you've been vocal about what you believe in. So I want to start with, what has this time revealed to you about our collective priorities in the West? To you personally, what has it revealed that perhaps wasn't as clear or you weren't as conscious of in the past?
Yeah, that's kind of quite a big question. I mean, if you mean specifically how it has impacted me personally, um, it's interesting that you talk about risk, and obviously, this is something that a lot of people have struggled with, probably, who maybe have wanted to speak out or have wanted to look more closely at this issue and have been reluctant to do so because perhaps they know that in doing so, it would force their hand to have to make the moral choice of whether to speak up or stay silent. So I think the number one problem is that a lot of people have just been, I think, just ignoring even looking. And they're provided a very neat excuse for doing so by the sort of Zionist propaganda talking point that this is a very complex issue, that it's a religious issue, that it goes back thousands of years. All that nonsense that if you pick up a book and read the 100-year colonial history of the colonization of Palestine, you realize very quickly that that's just pure obfuscation and smoke and mirrors. But it's a very convenient excuse for, I would say, probably the broader public, who, let's face it, are mostly decent people, right, with a conscience. It's a very convenient excuse for them to sort of throw their hands up and say, "Oh yeah, well I understand that this is very difficult. The Middle East is such a fraught and complex place, and um, so the sort of willful ignorance is one component that is shocking, to discover that so many people, even in spite of clear evidence that there is a horrible atrocity taking place, are still kind of willing to fall back on conveniently provided sort of excuses and propaganda. What's obviously far worse is the people who do know better and have looked into this issue and do understand what's happening. Um, I mean, from a personal point of view, it has been utterly shocking. I mean, I haven't mentioned this publicly yet, but I might as well tell you. I lost my management of 10 years in December of 2003 because of my advocacy. Um, so, I'm now still without management. It's fine. I'm happy to part ways with people who are going to have a problem with me advocating for liberation and against, genocide. But it was shocking. It was shocking, and the initial approach was an interesting one because, it was a soft approach about, you realize how insidious some of this ideology is, where I received an email telling me ostensibly that I didn't understand the issue, and that ultimately, you know, quoting people like Norman Finkelstein and Jewish Voice for Peace and Ilan Pappé, these are all Jewish voices, by the way, that quoting these voices was token anti-Semit, that I was tokenizing these people. essentially obliquely suggesting that I'm anti-Semitic, that I need to correct my approach, and perhaps my time would be put to better use just raising money for the children of Gaza in some humanitarian effort. I assume the children that are left once the massacre is finished. So that was a deeply shocking moment when I pushed back against that, and then it quickly escalated to, we can no longer work with you. I guess this is me publicly announcing that at this point. Um, and seeing so many people in the industry who I know, who I've worked with. Look, I lived in Los Angeles for a long time. I know a lot of people in film, in music. Um, I've always been sort of outside the mainstream industry in many ways, but I've certainly interacted with it. And so I've been shocked is it doesn't even cover to discover how many people I know personally are not just keeping silent, but are actively supporting the colonial regime. Um, and that's been shocking. It's been shocking to discover how deeply um, implicated this industry is on that front, deeply implicated. And not just the music industry, so many cultural spaces, mainstream cultural spaces, institutions that we would have assumed that, that purport to be liberal cultural spaces on this issue are actually deeply racist, sort of. I mean, we can get to what I think causes, this anti-Arab racism, but like deeply Islamophobic and racist and pro, essentially, let's just call it what it is. White supremacist European colonialism. I mean, so it's been shocking to discover, and it's a very isolating feeling because I've had to shed a lot of I've had to face. I've lost work. There's no question that I've lost work opportunities. I mean, I honestly, I'm lucky enough that I'm able to say I don't care. I don't live a lavish lifestyle. I've never been interested in material things. I'm not into fame. Um, so I can take it or leave it, honestly. But I do realize that for a lot of other artists who do rely far more on this system, it must be very it must make them very nervous to have to take a stand or decide whether they're going to take a stand.
We'll talk more about other artists because I really do want to get your perspective on the folks who are passive or inactive. How do they silently justify that to themselves? I'd like to get your perspective on that. But just to stick with you for a bit longer, what was this evolution towards activism like? And I almost a little bit reticent about asking that question because when the subject matter is genocide, there is no evolution towards activism. It's either you get it or
Yeah.
you don't.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a lot of people don't get it, and the my optimistic side wants to think people will eventually get it. The folks that don't get it right now,
Yeah.
so there necessarily will be an evolution towards that. So to the degree to which you can reverse engineer how you got here, was there a breaking point for you, or has there always been like a hum? Have you always been conscious of that, or was there a moment that ignited it for you?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a really good question. I think it's an interesting one because I've had a lot of pushback from people, certainly in the early days, who have not experienced me using my voice so loudly, and so directly and put political in inverted commas here. Um, and it's interesting because in some ways I have always taken the approach. Look, I'm smart at, like, I'm an educated person, and I suppose one of the my main focus points in my art, in my writing, has always been an attempt to sort of wake people up to the sort of, let's call it, the dysfunction in this culture of ours, which is a diseased culture, right? Neoliberal, end stage capitalist, white supremacist, privileged, capital, extractive culture that we live in, and we're all complicit in it to some degree. and it's very difficult to find ways to extricate ourselves. My view as an artist, and perhaps I realize now that that I've been wrong in my approach. That my view was always that the political, again in inverted commas, the political space, the political narrative, um, has almost been co-opted by the capitalist system. So as an artist, to stand up and to be directly critical of the system, to write anti-war songs, protest songs. I always felt that it's almost like, the 60s has been and gone, and it's almost like the capitalist system has inoculated itself against that kind of direct. Do you know what I mean? It's made itself immune against it by almost, by selling Che Guevara merch and sort of, it's almost like revolution has become almost like a capitalist sort
Yeah.
of merch enterprise. So my philosophy, if I have one, not to sound heavy-handed about this, but really very basically speaking, has always been a more oblique approach. That my job as an artist is not to try to be instructive or to be morally didactic, but is rather, especially in a culture that is so saturated with just sort of like soporific content that is designed to put people to sleep and make people apathetic. Um, my job as an artist is instead, in a more oblique way, to try to simply find ways to wake people up to their own sense of agency and their own sense of conscience, and then they will do the work to see what is rotten around them. So I've kind of been that's always been my approach in art. It's more to try and reach people on an emotional level, a more oblique level, in the hope that the goodness in people, is always there. In fact, interestingly, I had this discussion with Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine many years ago, because he's obviously someone who's taken a very direct approach. And we had this conversation one night. I met him. He's actually a really lovely guy, and he was very sweet and came to a couple of shows. Um, and we had this conversation, and I feel almost embarrassed. I was so young and naive at the time. Me telling him these grandiose ideas, that I had a different philosophy from him in how to reach people. Uh, and now I see. I won't say that I see that I was wrong in that, but there comes a point where, when something is in crisis, you know, you can't sit back and hope that, well, slowly I'll wake people up. I mean, I think that's the difference right now today, right? Is that it's one thing to talk about a culture that is rotten, that is contributing to, because it's obviously not Palestine, it's everywhere, that is continuing to exploit and oppress people all over the planet, and to talk about how this is a systemic problem and how we have to try and undo it, and hopefully that people will wake up to their own sense of goodness. It's another thing to look at a Western backed Holocaust that is happening in real time. That needs to be addressed head on. And I suppose that's where I feel that's why people are like, oh, what is it all of a sudden now that you're speaking up about Palestine? Well, because our government could put a stop to this tomorrow. If enough people demanded, if we shut down the buildings, if we all went on strike, we could actually stop this tomorrow. Can we stop colonial extraction and exploitation all around the world? We can eventually, but we can't do it tomorrow. There's no switch. Whereas on this specific issue, there is a switch. Literally, we could switch it off tomorrow. So, so agitating for that just seems like it's a no-brainer. That's why I've become so involved in this, I guess, in the last couple of years.
Um,
Sorry,
that
that was a
no, no,
very
no,
long, circuitous answer.
no. It was comprehensive, and I really, really like this visual and concept of the insufficiency of the oblique approach. And I think that's what a lot of people, artists especially, are struggling with. That we live in a culture where it only pays to be suave and to be slick about your brand.
Yeah,
And if a brand is direct, then it will not be effective. If a brand is in your face and purposeful and
Mm,
sincere, it trips over itself just in terms of how our content ecosystem rewards how you present yourself. So
interesting.
I think what a lot of people are struggling with, people who have a platform, is how do I pivot from being this, let's say, oblique artist that comes at you in subvertive ways, even when I'm trying to make a noteworthy point? How do I pivot
Mm,
from that to recording myself and just speaking into camera saying there's a genocide happening and it's the most important thing that we have to face currently.
mm,
I don't think a lot of people are comfortable doing that. They've built a
yeah,
fan base that is been trained to respond to subversion and to respond to things that are not direct. So I think that's a
yeah.
really, really astute point that a lot of people sympathize with. Just quickly, on one more thing. I really like this I guess quote or just thing that you said recently that hiding the light within is not always a bad thing.
Mm,
And it's one of the things that happens with activism, especially if you're not trained in that. Let's say, you didn't come up through law and or like you're not a career activist, and then you take that on in response to moral urgency, is it's easy to get burnt out and it's easy
yeah,
to spread yourself thin. So that was one
yeah.
of the things that you said recently that I think is a nod to the self-preservation that's part and parcel to activism, which is hiding the light within is not always a bad thing. And you go on to say that sometimes to keep the light alive, you need to shield it from the sight of those who smother it. Um, Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, but specifically, what is your approach, both personally and I guess advice to people in general? How do
Mm,
you take on this mantle of I am going to speak truth to people and to power
mm,
without burning up too quickly?
yeah. I mean, look, I wish I had an answer for that. It's really these are forces that are pulling in different directions for sure. Interestingly enough, I feel that, these are forces that are pulling in different directions anyway as an artist, and I've felt that my whole life. I mean, we struggle, at least for me, between the need to belong and the need to be free. And in belonging, in seeking a community and seeking a place to belong, I say this as someone who has been very aloof from the culture and even from community in many ways. I mean, I've had an interesting trajectory as an artist because I have been kind of accepted in a far more mainstream way than fundamentally I feel comfortable with. I live in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. I left Los Angeles as soon as I could on finishing my first record. I find self promotion extremely difficult and sort of embarrassing. Uh, I've never felt particularly comfortable and always felt very suspicious of the culture itself. Even, to get back to the point you were saying before, that you think artists feel uncomfortable about making the pivot. I would push back on that a little bit and say, not to sound jaded and not to sound judgmental, but I think a lot of artists, it's not that they feel uncomfortable, it's that they actually don't particularly feel like they have. Um, I don't think I think a lot of artists who have chosen comfortable liberal positions that are um, that are easy for their base to consume because they're sort of like easy to sell. Um, it's very easy to in our culture today to say that you're liberal on certain issues, right? And be very successful as an artist. That to me is not necessarily coming from a sincere and authentic place. And this has been one of the shocks, to be honest. And I don't necessarily want to name names right now, but there are some very big artists who have made a career on supposedly, ostensibly being anti establishment and against the machine, and sort of, who turn out to be absolutely complicit in this neoliberal inanity. They are essentially it turns out, have been peddling and benefiting from the sort of colonial privilege that the West sort of enjoys. That aside, to get back to what I was saying about what was I saying?
Well,
About being kind of aloof from the culture,
yeah.
um, and finding a way to find a balance between speaking directly and protecting your energy. Um, it's something that I'm struck. I mean, to be honest, I'm in a state of total exhaustion, burnout right now as we sit here, me talking to you. I don't. The last 2 years, I have felt um, like I have had to spend all my time pretty much speaking directly to this issue, directly to the people on my platform who are listening to me, to make up for the silence of others. You know,
Hmm.
I feel like, in theory, if as a community, if as an artistic community, all of us were speaking, we could, I'd probably live in more balance right now, and I'd have time to also focus on nurturing the sort of, I suppose, the more traditional work that I do. Instead, I've found myself like feeling like if I take one day off looking at the news and trying to amplify the latest piece of news, for example, yeah, the murder of Al Jazeera journalists, or the targeting of hospitals, or you know, that I'm somehow shirking my responsibility, and it's a very difficult position that I find myself in, and so it made it even more difficult by the fact that I think I have a quite an interesting uh, I'm an interesting kind of case study in some ways, because I am articulate enough and a good enough communicator on this superficial level to be able to present arguments to people, to be able to present information in an intelligible way to people, and to be able to communicate to people, hopefully in a convincing way that maybe subverts some of the propaganda that they've been fed. So there's this very surface level on which I feel like I'm actually pretty capable at communicating. But of course, is it using my resources to best ability? Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm probably a better communicator in terms of as an art maker. I'm not. There are plenty of people out there doing what I'm doing, very effectively communicating the news, the history, far better versed in the history than I am. So I find myself in this place where I know I have an audience who listens. I know I can communicate well, but I wish I could also, you know, people say to me, what you really need to do is finish this music you've been making for 10 years, because that will then increase your platform. That's another thing, I've sort of, I kick myself for having been so aloof from the culture and the industry for the last, since I've started my career. My music has probably reached a wider audience than my engagement on the platforms would indicate. And that's
Mhm.
solely because I have just not been active on the platforms. I don't, like I said, I don't like promoting myself. I don't like being on there. So as a result, I have a far smaller platform than maybe I could have had if I'd gamed the system a little bit and been plugging away like the other eager beavers for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And I'm now almost kicking myself because I could have had a much bigger platform to reach more people on this issue. So I'm sort of caught in this strange place where I don't know where to focus my energy. You're right. It's really frustrating.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Well, there is moral clarity in that confusion of not knowing where to focus your energy, because it's a little bit of a Janus-faced problem that you have, that um, you're right. I think a lot more people know, well, exponentially more people know Alexi Murdoch, the musician,
Yeah.
than Alexi, the activist. But as you started this thing with, um, the sorts of changes that music can make are the more sort of like iceberg level changes,
Mm,
emotional, cultural changes. Whereas the switch that needs to happen today, yesterday, in fact, in regards to the genocide happening in Gaza,
yeah.
you know, I yeah, I'm probably going to regret saying this, but I don't think
Mm.
music can make that switch, right?
Yeah.
Something like sometimes you just do need to speak in plain English,
Yes.
right? So that confusion is legitimate. I know we're coming up on time here, but uh,
It's, by the way, I'm fine if you. I'm
okay,
not like pressed,
okay,
so whatever. Yeah.
okay. Well, I've made a personal note to whenever someone brings up neoliberalism to always go back to it and give them more opportunity to speak on it because
Okay.
you used the word earlier. I think it
Mm,
was insidious. You were describing something and you
mm,
described it as insidious, just in terms of how stealthy, how much stealth these liberal institutions rely on to evade moral responsibility, and it's a very insidious mechanism. There's nothing more insidious than neoliberalism
yeah.
because the same way that you mentioned capitalism having a foolproof, like Teflon resistance to revolution,
Yeah.
neoliberalism has that built in. There is no sort of moral question that you can pose to the neoliberal that they don't already have a degree in responding to without actually making any changes in terms of
Mm,
actions. So the
mm,
question here for you is there a type of activism that does more harm than good on this issue?
mm.
Because we're seeing a lot of sort of watermelon pin activism
Yeah.
where people are starting to panic that this my silence is actually hurting my brand. And
Mm,
the optimistic part of me wants to say, well, look, even if they're doing it for the sake of their brand, they're still bringing attention to this issue, even if they're doing it in a
yeah.
sort of performative, clearly
Yeah.
transactional way. So, but
Yes.
what would you say to that? Is there activism that does more harm than good on this?
Okay. This is. I mean, this is the crux. This is an excellent question, and this is a question that I can't say that I have an answer to. And I obviously, I've been speaking with Palestinian people about this, who work in the human rights space. And we, in fact, just last week I was having a conversation with this amazing woman, and we were arguing about how to respond to exactly this new emerging self-interested sort of lip service style. Um, I couldn't give you a definitive answer, but I will say this. I find, you know, and I will just call it out because why not? And you can edit it out if you don't want to use his name. I'll give an example. I saw a couple of days ago, I saw an Instagram post from Mark Ruffalo. Now, Mark Ruffalo has worked definitely, in the sort of in the environmental space, in rights, indigenous rights. There's no question. However, here's where things become problematic. I saw an Instagram post of Mark Ruffalo on one of his things with a little. They've started some campaign. I think it's called Half Hearts for Gaza. Okay, so you've got celebrities. Now, this is part of the problem. The fact that we're even looking to celebrities to tell us what our moral position should be is deeply problematic. But let's just put that aside for the moment. So you have this new campaign where it's become a social media thing, and celebrities start doing these half hearts for Gaza photos with little "I love Gaza." And I would just say this: Can you imagine Can you imagine having a campaign like this with half hearts for Auschwitz? You know, I mean, just think about how deeply horrifying even the concept is that you're essentially you're it sort of trivializes, it turns it into this is some kind of love, we're sending love. These people are literally being systematically mass exterminated. This is a fact. No one who's a serious person who's looking at the facts on the ground would argue against that. They are enacting a kind of final solution style action to completely ethnically cleanse um, the Gaza Strip. Now, to have someone with such a large platform and many others because I see, people putting in their stories on Instagram, oh, support the Samud flotilla, but they won't put it in their main stories. To have this sort of very lukewarm, yes, on the one hand, it does bring some attention, but you have to think about what is the content of the messaging. Because if you're bringing attention, but at the same time, what you're doing is you're kind of normalizing the idea that
Mm.
this is actually just a humanitarian issue. This is something that we can resolve using neoliberal tactics of charity and humanitarian assistance, as opposed to this requires a radical and revolutionary upheaval of the colonial imperial system that is at the root of this problem. Then my answer would be, yeah, in the long term, you are doing more harm than good, because what you're doing is you're pushing the idea that actually we can get back to some kind of status quo where we've wiped out hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, but maybe we rebuild some kind of enclave for them or for whoever's left, these traumatized, you know, devastated people, and we go back to feeling comfortable not talking about it again for another 10, 20 years, um, until the next crisis. So, yeah, I think that kind of activism, if there's not sincerity, I was thinking about this earlier, I was thinking of saying something to this effect that I think I find more galling than people's silence is their insincerity. Um, it's so easy again not to rail on Mark Ruffalo. I'm sure he's a nice guy, but I remember a clip early days at the Oscars where he runs up and he's running up the red carpet, and they had shut down traffic or something. Some pro-Palestine thing had shut down traffic, and he's running into the Oscars, and he's going, "We did it, free Palestine. We shut down traffic." But he's running into the Oscars ceremony. I mean, it's just like that. It's just like, man, like that. The message that is sending people is that you just do the bare minimum of waving a peace sign, of maybe posting something on your Instagram, but you still participate fully and wholeheartedly in the neoliberal system that is deeply implicated and responsible for the disenfranchisement of so many of our human siblings.
That's just incredibly well put because to quote you again, you said more galling than people's silence is their insincerity is such an astute way of putting what I otherwise feel a little bit self-conscious about, which is when people are not serious about the activism, it gets in the way of real activists. But to say that feels almost self-centered. It almost feels like you're, I don't know, pearl clutching when it comes to what counts as real activism.
Yeah.
It does matter. And sometimes, as much as this conversation has been about the dangers of silence, but
Mm.
sometimes if your speech normalizes the problem and turns it
Yeah.
into like something that you could dial a 1-800 number to support,
Yeah.
then you're creating a cottage industry
Yeah.
around the perpetuation of things as insane as a genocide or everything else that goes down that list. And so that's a really good way to put it. And um I think that'll be one of the biggest, hopefully one of the biggest takeaways, or in the
Mm.
aftermath, hopefully there's an aftermath, is
Yeah.
that there is no standardized solution to what's happening. You just have to be willing to be
Yeah.
exhausted by the
Yeah.
revolutionary act of changing your mind and like there is no easy way to do this. And nothing will ruffle the feathers of both folks who are listening to this or just people in general than telling them there is no easy way to do something.
Yes.
That's the real heart of colonialism, is this
Yeah.
concept of comfort. And if
Yeah.
I'm not comfortable, then my identity is in question. Um, anyways, so
I mean, that's very well put. I mean, I think, if I could take that one step further, one of the things that we all need to look at even those of us who are active, who have recognized, who are calling this out, who are doing the work, who are trying to amplify, we all need in this culture to come to terms with our own addictions, our own addictions to comfort. We are extremely privileged, not all of us, but I mean, in the West, let's just say, we have extracted our wealth from other parts of the planet over decades, over centuries. So, and we are living in the residuals of that wealth. Okay. I live in the UK. I go to Glasgow. I see the big buildings. They were all built off the income of slave trading, off the sugar plantations, all these big houses. You go down to London, you see these beautiful buildings, everyone's going and taking photos. That money was stolen from India. I mean, we didn't, the wet, I mean, forget America. I mean, we know the problems there in North America. I mean, they are settler colonies, but we accept that, we learn that, we come to terms with it. But it has to be more than just saying, I live on unceded such and such land. And now let me tell you now, but I'm going to build my house and live in comfort. We have to be willing to become uncomfortable. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not going to be didactic about it. I know that I'm complicit, that I'm invested as well, that there's no way that you can have a bank account or drive a car without being complicit. But one of the things that I would say, I would challenge people, even people who are speaking up, is that it's easy to point fingers at people who are doing less than you are in this activism space. It's easy to do that, and they do deserve to be shamed, the people who are silent people. But we also can't lose sight of how deeply implicated we are. We can't lose sight. I think one of the most important things I would say is that this culture, the advertising, the propaganda from such an early age that has made us, this is a culture that basically grooms us to accept the kind of things that we're seeing. It grooms us to accept it through sort of like the acceptance of violence, the acceptance of othering, dehumanizing people who don't look like us, who are far away, the idea that the entire continent of Africa is some kind of savage, poor place, and we have to just keep sending aid so we don't stop and think, like, hang on a minute, like maybe actually there's no difference between the people there and the people here. It's just that they've been colonized and exploited for so long. These are very deeply insidious sort of ideological tools that have been used against us, and we have to overcome our own hubris of thinking that somehow, as independent thinkers, we are not susceptible to that received wisdom, received knowledge, and propaganda. And the culture that this comfort culture, this consumer culture, this celebrity culture. I know people who I see them who are for the cause, are active, and then I look and I see, but they still participate. They're still looking at celebrities and sort of, there's still this sort of lack of willingness to truly divest from things that maybe we've become kind of a little addicted to, but we know are not good. We know are not good for us, and we know are contributing to the problem. We need to start to be comfortable with the idea that we need to be uncomfortable. I think what you said is really interesting about the comfort thing. Sorry, that was very long-winded, but it's just something I've been thinking about a lot. Yeah.
It's funny that you say that's long-winded, and I think I've been doing these interviews for 5 years now, and the number of artists that give a perfectly well-timed answer, but then follow it up with "sorry about the length," and I've put that down to the TikTok 10-second
Yeah.
ecosystem, where like you have to get these sound bites out in 2 minutes max, and that's just not how. Because the length of your answers 10 years ago is
Yeah.
perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. I think it's also that, because I am quite isolated, I find myself when I get in a conversation with somebody and I'm having a real conversation,
Yeah.
I do tend to, especially after 3 coffees, like
Yeah.
really want to, really
Yeah.
want to.
Same here, brother. Same here. Last few questions here, and this next
Yeah,
one, like a little bit reticent about even putting in to the things I want to talk about, but it's a question about hope or like what comes after that. And the reason I'm reticent about that is actually something you've touched on, which is there is this again neoliberal instinct to be like to button everything up nicely and say, well, this is how it within the system that we live in, this is how
yeah,
this turns out well in the end,
yeah,
without actually changing that system.
yeah,
Um, but we do have to, like, the conversations like these, you would not have said yes to a conversation like this if there wasn't an inkling that things can get better and
yeah.
that conversations like these and the many that you're having can be a stepping stone in that direction. So hope is impossible
Mm,
um, whenever you are engaged in public discourse on important issues. So
mm.
I wanted to ask you, where does your source of hope on this particular issue of Palestine? Number one, where did
Yeah,
it come from? And then number two, what is the best case scenario in terms of what we learn collectively, the people who are conscious and paying attention?
yeah,
The best case scenario in terms of what we learn collectively about what's happening currently.
yeah. I mean, I think those two questions kind of almost have the answer is definitely related in the sense that, the learning is part of the hope, right? I mean, I find myself, looking at this situation just on a practical level, like logistical almost, if you want to talk, where there is a very real fear, and this is the thing. I don't mean to be hopeless in this situation, but we have to also acknowledge there is a very real situation, future where the colonial entity, the same, like we can look at examples in history. In South Africa there was decolonization. In Algeria there was decolonization, but in North America there was not decolonization. There are projects that succeed and have succeeded in history in genociding and ethnically cleansing the indigenous population almost in its entirety and succeeding in then whitewashing history. And then this is the thing. And then, years later it becomes fashionable to sort of do some mea culpa and make art that then makes money off it to add insult to injury, and talk about how, oh yeah, it was terrible what our ancestors did. I mean, given the level of just might, and I'm talking about brute force, at the disposal of the West and this colonial regime, and the apparent political unwillingness of anyone to step in and prevent this, worst case scenario, it looks very, very dark. Now, I don't want to dwell on that because we have to, like you say, hope that goodness and justice will prevail, right? Where I see hope, honestly, is in this movement has never been as large as it is today, for sure. And I've spoken to, I have a lot of Palestinian friends now in the last couple of years because, I've met a lot of Palestinians. They are truly like truly some of the most resilient, beautiful people I have met. I'm Greek. I'm actually Greek, so I feel like they're sort of like my cousins. I recognize so much in the culture, um, but the patience and the resilience, of a people who have lived not only with this brutality for generations now, who some of whom still have the deeds and the keys to their grandparents and their great grandparents' houses that sometimes are still there, sometimes have been demolished to make way for you know settler apartments or whatever. But the faith and the patience, um, more than that, the lack of bitterness, the hope that I see in Palestinian people is inspiring on a level that is unparalleled, really. Um, so that's I feel like I don't have a right to be hopeless when the people who are really the stakeholders in this keep hope alive. I have to keep hope alive with them.
Mm.
And where I see hope in our society is honestly in the sort of youth movement, in the youth movement today, because if we look back to Vietnam War, okay, the Vietnam War protests, they took 10 years, but like, if you look back at sort of activism even 20, 30 years ago, before this moment in time, what's interesting is that I think activists were far more atomized in a way. It was more, you might be an anti-war activist, you might be a civil rights activist, you might be an environmental campaigner, you know, those things, while obviously there was always intersectionality, they were more disparate than they are today. I think today the youth, by virtue of the fact that they are looking at systemic collapse across the board, they are seeing the unsustainability of systems. I think there is an emerging consciousness that really is starting to understand the complexity of the system. One of the things, and I'll just push this book really quickly for anyone listening, that you should read. Speaking of neoliberalism, is a small book by he's a British journalist and author called George Monbiot, and I think it's called something like The Hidden Doctrine or The Secret Doctrine. Um, and it's basically a small book that outlines the rise of neoliberalism out of capitalism and how it's sort of permeated the culture. But one of the things he says in the book, which is interesting, is that, one of the flaws we have today in our educational system is we don't teach we don't teach complex systems. To me, this is by design. This idea that if you if you if you raise people to think in a binary system, it becomes far easier to manipulate. Something is good or it's bad. Something is sort of worthy of your attention or it's not. I think the youth today is starting to understand the complexity of this system and the intersectionality of these problems. And so when we look at Palestine, I mean, the fact that you see someone like Greta Thunberg, who's an amazing, amazing young adult who has basically gone from being a teenage activist for climate to understanding that the climate is not unrelated to colonialism and imperialism, oligarchy, extreme wealth. All these things are essentially part of the same problem. Of course, she's been sidelined by the mainstream now because she's obviously speaking on issues that the mainstream don't want people to hear about. But I think the fact that I'm seeing people like her, I'm seeing people who truly speak in a deeply articulate way about these problems. They understand it as a systemic problem. It's not just superficial jingoistic activism. It's like, we need structural change. And that gives me hope, because I don't know when the last time that has happened, in at least in Western modern history.
Incredibly, incredibly well put. And for the folks who are interested, the book that Alexi mentioned earlier, the title is Invisible Doctrine: The Secret History of Neoliberalism
Yeah.
by George Monbiot. So my last question here is completely separate from all the things we've talked about. It's actually about the theme of the issue that this conversation will be in. And that theme is simply Sunday, which is our way of celebrating the least commercialized day of the week, and that is most conducive to engaging art and also engaging the more sort of introspective aspects of life, as much as we have that left in the sort of work a day. So that's why we're an issue that just celebrates this day as an art day. So the question is, what does your ideal Sunday look like? And what are some of the obstacles that you face in terms of not being able to reach that ideal Sunday as consistently as you'd like, as an artist and just as a person in general?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Obviously, the fact that my work doesn't have boundaries, um, that wouldn't have been so bad if it weren't for this, like, these devices and this endless email and open channels of communication, so that create stress even when you're not on them, because you know that the communications are still coming in. Um, the biggest obstacle, obviously, is the gadgets, is the phone, is the connectivity, what we call connectivity, which is, of course, disconnectivity, because it is disconnecting us from being present and being rooted and grounded. You know, it's I feel very lucky to be sitting here on the west coast of Scotland in one of the most quiet areas where I have no mobile reception, by the way, only internet. And is one of the quietest places, like a little harbor by the sea. So I feel a bit spoiled complaining about the lack of peace that all this electronic interconnectedness creates. I mean, I suppose, the perfect Sunday would be to really, is when the frequency is lowered, because I do think of the way we operate in terms of sort of like, frequencies. And I definitely can sense, even in my body, when I've been engaged with the devices online in this space. Um, I definitely can feel that I'm buzzing at a frequency that is probably would be called a stress frequency. It might feel interesting. I feel over caffeinated, whatever, but I'm sure there's like way too much cortisol in my system. It's just lots of ideas being generated. But ultimately, all of us, like I would say, need more Sunday in every day. I mean, this is the thing. I think that's part of the problem, isn't it? Is that we reserve some kind of special moment that we look forward to, and we put ourselves through kind of torment until we can take that holiday or make that space or that time for me. And in fact, we need to really work on incorporating that into our everyday in some way, to make that time to take your shoes off and put your feet on some bit of earth that isn't covered up, to to really slow down and push back against the idea, that when you're sitting staring at a wall, and when you're sitting staring at a wall and nothing is happening in your mind, that this is not something to be stressed about. This is not you not being efficient. This is like, I think it was, I think Rilke, the poet and writer, had this idea, which has always stuck with me for many years, of the vegetative state. And vegetative state doesn't sound, I don't know if that's the correct translation, um, but it's this state in which we are actually, things are percolating, um, things are being processed. It's the reason we sleep, right? Like, it's like we need to really embrace that. And this overstimulation, that the moment we stop and have a moment's silence that tells us we're not doing enough, again, on our sort of journey to be good neoliberal sort of producers and get more and acquire more stuff we don't need. We need to push back against that, because cognitively we are being damaged by this overstimulated environment, for sure. I mean, there's no question. There's science to back that up. The good thing is that, one of the things science shows us, as a last note, is that we are, the plasticity that we have as human beings cognitively is encouraging, because while we are able to rewire ourselves very quickly to become addicted to all this nonsense and stressed out, the reverse can also happen. It doesn't take long to actually undo some of that damage and get back to maybe a more, a calmer, where answers like this take a long time and we don't care how long they take.
Alexi, thank you so much. This has been incredible.
I'm
Eh,
very happy. Yeah, I'm very
yeah,
happy we had this chat. And I really appreciate you reaching out, because it does feel like, these kind of connections with you here is like, I mean, it's just, it brings hope. I think conversations like this do bring hope, and hopefully some of your listeners will feel that way too.